An elderly beggar is shocked to find a newborn baby in a dumpster. Then she does something that leaves everyone astonished. Helen no longer knew how long it had been since her life had shattered. The passing of the years had become irrelevant, lost in the dark alleys where she now took refuge. To the city, she was just another shadow, a face no one noticed. Before that, however, she had been a woman with an easy laugh, a bright look, and simple dreams. In the past, she had a home, even if modest, where she found happiness in the little things, her son's laughter, her husband's embrace at the end of the day. But life had never been kind to those already struggling to survive, and tragedy struck her without mercy. Her husband, a hard-working man who had always faced financial difficulties, died suddenly, leaving her alone with a young child. Without support, without relatives to turn to, Helen did what she could to support the boy. She worked wherever she could, cleaning houses, washing clothes, serving in kitchens. She fought against hunger and scorn, clinging to the only reason she had left to keep going: her son. But the city was not merciful to the poor. And when illness arrived, it took her child without hesitation, leaving her completely alone. The pain was so great that she never recovered. With no strength to go on, she lost everything, a piece at a time, until only she and the streets remained. Misery, however, did not erase her compassion. Despite being ignored by the world, Helen did not stop seeing others who also suffered. She shared the scraps she could get, fed abandoned dogs, helped other homeless people when she could. She had not become bitter, even when everyone treated her with indifference. On that cold night, the biting wind cut through Helen's thin clothes, reminding her of her cruel reality. Her bare feet were well acquainted with the hard asphalt, and hunger was no longer a novelty. She approached a trash can, rummaging through plastic bags in search of something to keep her alive for another day. Then she heard it. A weak, muffled sound, almost swallowed by the wind. She stood still, her trembling fingers still holding the torn plastic. Her heart raced as she recognized the sound. A cry. Small, hesitant. She desperately rummaged through the trash, pushing aside food scraps and dirty wrappers until she saw it. There, among the debris, a baby. The tiny body trembled under the merciless cold of the early morning. Its purple lips revealed the chill, fragile skin, exposed to abandonment. So small, so defenseless, thrown there as if it were worthless. Helen held her breath, a shock running through her body. Who could do something like this? Without thinking, she pulled the baby close, wrapping it with the only warmth she had, her own body. She felt the cold skin against hers, and her chest hurt as she realized how this life was on the brink of being forgotten. Her heart beat rapidly, and her mind buzzed with unanswered questions. But only one thing mattered. She had to save it. Holding the baby tightly against her chest, she struggled to stand. The baby cried softly, weak sobs that only increased her despair. "Stay with me, my little angel. Just hold on a little longer," she murmured, trying to shield it from the cruel wind. She needed help. She needed to get it to a safe place before it was too late. With uncertain steps, she walked down the dark sidewalk, ignoring the pain in her body. The streets were nearly empty, just a few shadows sleeping under awnings or hiding in corners. But no one looked at her. No one ever looked. If she asked for help, would they believe her? Who would listen to a beggar? But there was no time to hesitate. "A police station. I need to find one," she murmured, trying to remember where she had seen one. Her legs were weakening, her feet aching with every step, but she didn't stop. The baby was so quiet now. Too quiet. Fear gripped her chest. "Stay with me, little one. Please, stay with me." When she spotted the police station, she felt a brief moment of relief, but insecurity quickly returned. The well-lit building seemed distant, like a barrier she might not be able to cross. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open. the creak of the metal echoing through the lobby. The police officers looked up at her. First came disdain, then confusion. A beggar with a baby. "Hey, ma'am, you can't come in here!" One of the officers stood up, frowning. Helen ignored the hostility in his tone. "Please, help me," she said, her voice choked. The officer hesitated. His spotless uniform contrasted with the dirt on her clothes. His gaze analyzed every detail of her, as if searching for a reason to send her away. "What are you talking about?" He crossed his arms. Helen slightly opened the rags around the baby. The officer's breath caught for a moment when he saw the pale, motionless child. "I found him in the trash. Alone. He needs help." The air in the room seemed to change. Another officer approached quickly, this time without the stiffness of the first. "Where did you find him?" he asked, already extending his arms to take the baby. Helen hesitated for a second before handing him over. "Over there, near the square. I heard the crying and—" "Call an ambulance now!" the second officer shouted to his colleagues. The men began to move. The first officer, who had been looking at her with suspicion, now seemed uncomfortable. "The baby, will he be okay?" Helen asked, her voice breaking. "We'll do everything we can, ma'am. You did the right thing," said the second officer. Helen felt her legs give way and let herself fall into one of the chairs in the lobby. Her hands were empty now, but the weight of what had just happened still rested on her shoulders. The baby was in the officer's hands, and for the first time in years, she felt she had done something that really mattered. But fear still haunted her. Would he survive? Was there still time to save him? While one of the officers rushed out with the child in his arms, another approached her, his gaze evaluative. "I need you to stay here, ma'am," he said, his voice firmer now. "We have some questions for you." Helen looked at the door the officers had exited through, her heart tightening. "But the baby—" "The doctors will take care of him," the man assured her. "Now, we need you to tell us exactly where and how you found him." She swallowed dryly, feeling her throat tighten. Her gaze returned to the dirty floor of the station, as if she could still see the tiny body shivering from the cold among the trash bags. "I was at the square. I was looking for food, like I always do. Then I heard the crying," she began, her voice weak. "At first I thought I was imagining it, but when I rummaged through the bags, he was there." The officer nodded, taking note of every word. "Was he wrapped in anything? Any blanket, any clothes?" "Just a thin cloth. He was so cold." The man sighed, exchanging a brief glance with the colleague beside him. "Do you have any idea who might have left him there?" Helen shook her head. There was no one, just him, alone. The officer took a few more notes before closing his notebook. "We'll investigate. You can go now, but if we need anything else, we'll come back to find you." She nodded slowly, feeling a deep exhaustion weigh on her body. She looked one last time at the door where the baby had been taken, and not knowing what else she could do, she stood up and walked back into the cold night. Minutes later, they were at the hospital, and doctors and nurses were moving quickly. The baby was handed over to the emergency team, and procedures to stabilize him began. Hypothermia was severe, and every minute counted. One of the doctors furrowed his brow as he analyzed the tiny body, trembling. If he had stayed there for a few more hours, he wouldn't have survived. The medical team worked urgently, monitoring vital signs, warming the baby gradually, administering IV fluids, and ensuring that his breathing stabilized. Slowly, he started to react. The temperature rose and the crying grew louder. Meanwhile, the police were already in action, determined to find who had committed such a cruel act. This was not just another abandonment, it was an attempted murder by negligence. The child could have died if it hadn't been for Helen's intervention. This was something no one there could ignore. The first step was to return to the spot where the baby had been found. They retraced Helen's steps, examined every corner of the square, searched nearby trash cans, and asked homeless people and street vendors who were still awake. But the night was a veil that hid secrets, and no one had seen anything beyond the usual darkness of the city. "If someone left him here, they didn't do it in broad daylight," one of the officers murmured. "We have cameras," said another. "There are a few on the streetlights in the square and on the street next to it. Let's check the footage." The officers returned to the station, where a technician was already working on analyzing the recordings. The monitors flickered as the videos were sped up and rewound, every second of the night being scrutinized for a clue. Then one of the investigators pointed to the screen. "There," he said, pausing the video and rewinding a few seconds. "Here it is." Everyone gathered around. On the screen, a frail figure hesitated as she walked down the sidewalk. The video was not clear enough to distinguish immediate details, but her movements revealed nervousness. She was carrying something in her arms, clutching it against her chest, as if her mind was engaged in an internal struggle. "She's looking around," observed one of the investigators. "It seems like she's trying to make sure no one's watching." The video advanced slowly. The woman stopped by the trash can, crouched down slowly, and for a moment froze. She stayed still, looking at the bundle, her trembling fingers holding the thin cloth covering the child. "Is she going to change her mind?" someone murmured. But then, with a final sigh, the woman left the baby there, adjusting the cloth around it, as if that gesture would be enough to protect it from the cruel cold. She hesitated. She didn't walk away immediately. She stood there for a few seconds, perhaps waiting for something to happen, for a miracle to unfold before her eyes and stop her from leaving. But the miracle didn't come. After another moment of uncertainty, she turned and disappeared into the darkness. The video was paused. "Now let's zoom in on her face," said the technician. The enlarged image revealed a pale, exhausted profile marked by anguish. Her eyes were sunken, her expression lost. She didn't look like a cruel criminal. She looked like a woman on the edge of the abyss. The investigators exchanged looks. "We have our suspect," said one of the officers. "Now we just need to find her." The search wasn't difficult. They had a face, and with a little more investigation, they quickly discovered a name. Sophia. Her name was listed in hospital records. She had given birth just a few days before at a public hospital in the city. There was no doubt about it. She was the baby's mother. "There's an address here," said one of the officers, holding up the paper. Soon after, they were at the door of the simple, worn building where she lived. The narrow, poorly lit corridor smelled of mildew, and the silence of the night made the place even more suffocating. One of the officers knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, this time harder. On the other side, a faint noise, dragged footsteps, a slight creak of the floor. The door slowly opened. There, standing in front of them, was Sophia. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, dark circles under her eyes as though she hadn't slept for days. Her lips trembled slightly, and her arms seemed weak, as if all the strength had drained from her body. She didn't ask what they wanted. She didn't protest, didn't try to run. She just stood there, motionless, looking at the uniformed men as if she already knew what was coming. One of the officers raised his badge. "Sophia, we need you to come with us to the station." She didn't react immediately. For a moment, she just lowered her head, took a deep breath. Then, without saying anything, she nodded slightly and stepped back, allowing the officers to enter. At the station, Sophia was taken to an interrogation room. The cold, impersonal environment seemed to make her even smaller than she already appeared. She sat down slowly, her shoulders slumped, her fingers interlaced on her lap. Her body seemed to weigh twice as much, as if all the guilt she carried had accumulated in that single moment. On the other side of the table, one of the investigators pulled up a chair and sat down as well. You know why you're here? He asked, his voice firm but without aggression. Sophia nodded slightly. You abandoned your baby on the street? The silence that followed was suffocating. Her red eyes were fixed on the table in front of her, her trembling hands resting on her lap. She took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to escape, but it was futile. The weight of guilt was overwhelming. When she finally found the strength to speak, her voice was weak, hesitant. I didn't want things to be this way, she murmured. But I was alone. I didn't know what to do. The officer kept his serious expression, observing her carefully. Alone? And the father of the child? Did he know? Sophia closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if the mere mention of the baby's father was painful. She swallowed hard and nodded slightly. Jacob! She pronounced the name with difficulty, as if the bitter taste of the memory was still stuck in her throat. He knew, but he never wanted anyone to know. The investigator exchanged a discreet glance with his colleague, taking out his notebook to write down the name. Who is Jacob? He asked. She hesitated before answering. Jacob. He's the son of an important man. His father has a lot of money, a lot of influence. She fidgeted nervously, her fingers pressing against each other. I never told him while I was pregnant. I was scared of how he would react, scared of being rejected, and deep down I thought I could raise my son on my own. The investigator frowned. So he didn't know about the pregnancy? She shook her head. No, I hid it until the end. I gave birth alone at the public hospital without telling anyone. I wanted to believe I could take care of him, that I'd figure it out. But I couldn't. I had no money, no one to help me. My son cried from hunger, and I couldn't even buy him milk. The investigator kept writing, the pencil sliding across the paper, but his gaze remained fixed on her. And when did you decide to tell Jacob? Sophia took a deep breath. After a few days, when I realized I couldn't do it on my own. That's when I looked for him. I thought maybe if he knew he could help me. He didn't need to take responsibility. I just wanted him to help me keep my son alive. The silence in the room grew heavier. What did he say? The officer asked, leaning slightly forward. Sophia's eyes filled with tears and her voice choked. He panicked, she whispered. He said I ruined his life, that if my baby existed, his father would never forgive him. He said he'd lose everything, the money, the name, the opportunities. He told me I should have gotten rid of the child earlier. She lowered her head, clutching her hands tightly. I tried to argue. I told him I didn't want anything from him, just a little help to take care of the baby. But he got scared. He said it was my fault, that I should have been more careful. And then he started pressuring me. Pressure how? The officer insisted. He would call me, send messages, telling me to deal with it on my own. He said I should get rid of the baby before it was too late. But I couldn't. I didn't want to. She took a deep breath, her shoulders trembling. Then he started threatening me. He said that if I told anyone, he'd make my life hell, that no one would believe me, that I'd end up alone. And I was already alone. My family couldn't help me, my parents couldn't take care of a baby, and the few friends I had left when they found out about the pregnancy. The officers continued to listen in silence. I swear I tried to take care of him alone. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. But I was weak. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. I could only think about what would become of us. My son cried from hunger, and I didn't know what else to do. Her breathing became irregular. That night, I didn't plan to do this, she sobbed. I left home not knowing where to go. I walked for hours with him in my arms, and then I stopped at the square. The officers exchanged a glance. Did you think of giving up? She nodded weakly. I thought about knocking on someone's door, asking for help, but who would help a stranger with a baby in her arms? Who would believe me? Her gaze was lost. I stood there, looking at him, and he cried. He cried so much, and I didn't know what to do. So, then I left him there and walked away. The words came out like a whisper, and at that moment Sophia crumbled. The officers stayed silent for a few moments after her words faded into the air. Only the sound of her trembling breath filled the room, interrupted by the sobs she tried to contain. The investigator in front of her sighed and slowly closed his notebook. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" he asked, his voice firm but without aggression. Sophia nodded, unable to lift her gaze. "Yes," she whispered. The other officer, who had been listening attentively, crossed his arms and leaned slightly forward. "Did Jacob know you were going to abandon the baby?" She hesitated for a moment, as if trying to organize her thoughts. "No, he never told me to do that. But he never helped me. He just wanted the baby to disappear. He wanted me to do anything, as long as it didn't involve him." The investigator wrote down the response and exchanged a quick glance with his partner. "We need to find Jacob." Sophia closed her eyes and took a deep breath before answering. "You'll find him. He doesn't hide." Her voice faltered. "He never needed to hide." The officers exchanged looks, recognizing the weight of that answer. Now they knew where to go. The officers left the station determined to find Jacob. With the name and information provided by Sophia, it wasn't difficult to track him down. Unlike his father, who lived in another city, Jacob lived in a luxury apartment in an upscale area. The building, modern and imposing, reflected the kind of life he led: comfort, privilege, and a bubble where he never had to face real consequences. When the officers arrived at the address, they were greeted by a well-dressed doorman who looked at them cautiously as soon as he realized they were police. "How can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, casting a suspicious glance. "We're here to see Jacob," one of the investigators said, showing his badge. The doorman hesitated. "Is he home?" the officer pressed. The man scratched his head, visibly uncomfortable. "I believe so, but he doesn't usually receive visitors without notice." "We're not asking permission, just tell him we're here." The doorman nodded quickly and picked up the phone. After a few seconds of waiting, someone answered on the other end. "Mr. Jacob, there are police here downstairs. They want to speak with you." There was a pause. Then the doorman frowned. He said to send them up. The officers exchanged glances before walking across the hall and getting into the elevator. When the door to the apartment opened, they found Jacob leaning against the wall with a glass in his hand. His gaze was pure boredom, as if their presence was just a minor inconvenience in his day. "Good morning," he said without real interest. "What do you want?" The investigators entered without waiting for an invitation and closed the door behind them. One of them took out a notebook, while the other kept his arms crossed, analyzing the young man in front of him. "We need you to come with us to the station to clarify some matters," one of the officers said bluntly. Jacob raised an eyebrow, pretending to be surprised. "Matters about what?" "The baby that was found abandoned." The glass he was holding lightly tapped the table beside him as he processed the information. His expression didn't change much, just a slight roll of his eyes revealed his annoyance. "Sophia told you, didn't she?" he sighed. "She told us the truth. Now we want to hear your version." Jacob shook his head and let out a short, humorless laugh. "Of course, because I'm the villain in this story, right?" The officers didn't respond. They just waited. Jacob put down the glass and ran a hand through his hair, as if debating whether it was worth continuing with this. Then he huffed and raised his arms. "Fine, let's get this over with." At the station, he was taken to the interrogation room, where he threw himself into the chair as if he were bored. The investigator sat across from him and opened the notebook. "Start from the beginning," said the officer. "What was your relationship with Sophia?" Jacob sighed, crossing his arms. "We were together for a while, but it was never anything serious." "You knew she was pregnant?" Jacob ran his tongue over his lips and looked away for a brief moment before answering. "No, I didn't know anything." The investigator frowned slightly. "She said you only found out after the baby was born." He let out a low, humorless laugh. "It's true. One day, she just showed up and told me." "And how did you react?" Jacob leaned back in the chair and huffed. "How do you think?" "I was shocked. I have my life, my plans. I can't just drop everything to become a dad." The investigator remained impassive, writing something down before continuing. "And what did you do afterward?" "I told her to figure it out," he replied, shrugging. "I told her I couldn't have a kid right now. I wasn't ready." The officer kept his gaze fixed on him. "Did you suggest she get rid of the baby?" Jacob rolled his eyes, irritated with the insistence of the questioning. "I didn't say it in so many words, but yeah, I hinted at it. Because let's face it, it was the best option for both of us." The officer clenched his fists on the table. "She told us that she tried to take care of the baby on her own, but you pressured her. She said that if your father found out, you would lose everything." Jacob laughed, leaning back in the chair. "And isn't that true? If my father found out, my life would be over. He'd never accept me having a kid now, especially like this." So instead of taking responsibility, you let her figure it out on her own." Jacob gave a slight mocking smile. "She knew the risks. I didn't ask for this." The silence that followed was heavy. The investigator slowly closed the notebook and stared at Jacob. "You know that a child almost died, right?" Jacob crossed his arms and looked away. "It's not my problem." The investigators exchanged glances, aware that Jacob wouldn't show any remorse. The interrogation only confirmed what they already suspected. He didn't care, didn't see the gravity of what had happened, and most of all, didn't want to take any responsibility. To him, the blame was entirely on Sophia, as if he hadn't been part of the decision that led to the child's abandonment. But this case wasn't just about punishing the responsible parties. An innocent life had been thrown in the trash, and now this baby needed a safe future. Since Jacob had already made it clear he wouldn't take any responsibility, the investigators needed to take another approach. That's when one of the officers suggested a name. "And his father?" asked one of the investigators. The others exchanged looks. It was a possibility. Donald was a name that carried weight, a respected man, known for his unquestionable authority. A successful businessman, owner of lands and businesses, he had always been strict both in business and in raising his son. His name didn't just mean wealth. It symbolized a history of firm decisions, a sense of responsibility that directly contrasted with Jacob's irresponsible attitude. But this wasn't just a family matter. They weren't going to contact Donald to ask if he wanted custody of the child. That would be up to the appropriate authorities. The goal was different. They needed to know what his son had done. And more than that, they needed to understand what his position would be regarding the incident. The decision was made quickly. One of the officers picked up the phone and dialed. The call didn't take long to be answered. The investigator went straight to the point. He explained the situation without going into details, informing Donald that Jacob was being detained for a serious crime and that his presence was required at the station. He didn't go into specifics about the incident, only emphasized the urgency of the matter and the seriousness of the charges. On the other end of the line, Donald stayed silent for a moment. His heavy breathing was audible, but he didn't ask questions. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and sharp. "I'm on my way." In a few hours, Donald arrived. He wasn't a man to waste time. As soon as he stepped into the station, his presence dominated the room. Tall, with a rigid posture and a penetrating gaze, he carried a natural authority that made everyone around him straighten instinctively. He didn't need to speak loudly to be heard, nor to be respected. The officers led him to a private room, where they explained everything again, this time in minute detail. Donald remained still in the room, absorbing every detail the officers gave him. His face remained impassive, but his eyes were dark, reflecting the growing anger inside him. He had always believed in the power of the name he carried, in the importance of honor and responsibility, and now he discovered that his own son had renounced not only a duty, but humanity itself. The tension in the room was palpable. The investigators knew that Donald wasn't a man of empty words or impulsive reactions. Everything he did was calculated, final. After a long silence, he raised his gaze to the officer in front of him. "I want to see him," he said, his voice full of firmness. The officers nodded and stood up. Jacob was still in custody, and his arrogant posture hadn't changed since his arrival, but that wouldn't last long. The officers led Jacob to the room without explaining much, and he followed without seeming concerned. He walked with his shoulders relaxed, his steps slow, as though this was still just a minor inconvenience. But when he crossed the door and saw Donald sitting across from him, his expression changed for a brief moment. It wasn't fear exactly, but deep discomfort. His father was rigid, his eyes cold as blades, his jaw clenched. The weight of his presence made the room feel smaller, suffocating. Jacob tried to hide it, adjusting his posture and throwing a contained smile. "So, you called me for a family conversation?" he asked with disdain. Donald didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned his son as though trying to see something inside him, perhaps a remnant of dignity or remorse, but all he found was indifference. The prolonged silence made Jacob shift uncomfortably in his chair, and he decided to fill the void with words. "I don't know what you want to hear," he began, feigning casualness. "I've already explained everything. I never asked to be a father. Sophia should have told me earlier, but she decided to hide it. What could I do?" Donald remained silent, not moving a muscle. Jacob ran his tongue over his lips and continued. "I said from the beginning that I wasn't ready. I'm young. I have a life ahead of me. I can't just throw it all away because of a mistake that wasn't even mine." The last phrase seemed to resonate in the heavy air of the room. Donald inhaled slowly, without averting his gaze. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice low but with a sharp weight. Jacob swallowed hard but didn't back down. "I didn't mean it like that." He tried to correct himself, his tone less certain. "But look, I didn't abandon anyone. I didn't tell her to leave the baby in the street. That was her choice." Donald still didn't respond, but something in his posture changed, a subtle hardening of his shoulders. Jacob tried to keep control of the conversation. "She could have thought better," he continued. "She could have asked someone else for help. I warned her I couldn't get involved." The sound of the chair scraping across the floor was the only warning before Donald abruptly stood up. Jacob barely had time to react before his father's heavy palm struck his face with a sharp, hard slap. The impact made his head turn, and for a moment the silence in the room was absolute. Jacob froze, instinctively bringing his hand to his hot cheek. His eyes widened in shock, not so much from the pain, but from the disbelief. Never in his life had his father raised a hand against him. Donald remained still, his eyes fixed on him, filled with contempt. But there was no uncontrolled fury there, only the coldness of a man who looked at his own son and saw nothing but disappointment. "You are nothing," Donald said, his voice low but cutting. Jacob blinked, stunned. "You have no character," he continued. "You have no courage. You are a weak man who hides behind the family name, but you are not worthy of it." Jacob opened his mouth to protest, but Donald subtly raised his hand, silencing him with a look. "There is no greater punishment than stripping you of what you always thought was guaranteed," he declared. "From this moment on, you are alone." The coldness in Donald's words made Jacob tremble more than the slap he had received. "You will no longer have my name. You will no longer have my money. You will have nothing." Jacob felt the ground open beneath his feet. Donald took a step back and threw one last look at his son, now pale, unable to respond. Then he turned to the officers. "Do whatever is necessary. I won't intercede for him." The investigators nodded. Jacob would not only lose everything he had, but he would also be legally held accountable for his involvement in the case. What had once been a game for him had now become an unforgiving reality. Donald left the room without looking back. His mind was no longer on Jacob. His son was no longer his concern. He needed to focus on what truly mattered, his grandson's future. The weight of responsibility now fell on him, and while he knew he couldn't change the past, he could ensure that this child would have a dignified future. The officers informed him that Sophia was still at the station. Once he received the news, Donald asked to see her. When she was brought in, she entered hesitantly, avoiding eye contact. Her shoulders were slumped, her gaze low, as though she expected a condemnation before he even said anything. The silence between them was thick. Donald observed her with a heavy gaze, but there was no anger in his eyes, just judgment, yes, but without the hatred she thought she'd find. Sophia opened her mouth to speak, but her voice faltered. She took a deep breath and tried again. "Sir, she began, her voice trembling. Donald raised a hand slightly, stopping her before she could continue. "I don't want your apologies," he said, his voice firm but not aggressive. "I want to know if you have the strength to raise your child." The impact of the question made Sophia lift her head suddenly. Her eyes widened, confusion evident in her expression. I, she stammered, feeling a knot tighten in her throat. Donald remained impassive, waiting. Sophia felt the words trapped inside her, as if she couldn't articulate an answer. Her heart raced because she had never imagined this man would ask her something like this. All she had expected was condemnation, threats, perhaps even the promise that he would take her child from her forever. But there he was, asking for an answer that she didn't even know how to give. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Donald tilted his head slightly, analyzing her. "You want?" he repeated, with a tone that sounded more like a challenge than a confirmation. Sophia clenched her fists at her sides. "Yes," she said, now with more certainty. "I know I was wrong. I know what I did has no justification, but I never wanted to hurt my son. I was desperate, I was weak, but I don't want to keep being that way. I want to fix what I've done. I want to raise him. I want to be his mother." Donald stayed silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on her. "You'll pay for what you did," he said, not looking away. "Justice will take care of that." She nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words. "I know," she replied. Donald crossed his arms and took a deep breath. "If you want to be a mother, then prove you deserve that chance." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "I will," she promised, and for the first time since being brought to the station, she felt that there was still hope for her and her son. But Donald knew there was one more person he owed something to. After resolving Sophia's fate, he turned to the officers and asked one question. "Who saved my grandson?" The officer accompanying the case stepped forward and answered immediately. "It was a woman named Helen," he said, "a homeless woman." Donald frowned. "A beggar?" The officer nodded. "Yes. She was the one who found the baby and brought him to us. If it hadn't been for her, we wouldn't have gotten there in time." Donald remained silent for a moment. The fact that a woman who had nothing had shown more humanity than his own son was something he couldn't get out of his mind, and that's when he decided he needed to find her. "I want to see her," he said, and as always, his order went unquestioned. The search for Helen took a few hours. The officers provided a photo captured by the cameras at the station the night she brought in the baby. With the help of some staff members, Donald walked through the streets, asking people living on the streets about her, but finding someone who didn't want to be found was a difficult task. When they finally located her, she was sitting in a corner of the square, a skinny dog by her side, her eyes lost in the horizon. Her posture was hunched from time, her shoulders wrapped in old rags, her face marked by years of misery and abandonment. She didn't seem surprised when she saw a man like Donald approaching. People like him didn't usually talk to people like her, and the first thought that crossed her mind was that they wanted to chase her away. Donald stopped in front of her and observed her for a few seconds before speaking. "Helen!" She blinked a few times, adjusting slightly, but didn't respond immediately. He didn't move, just waited. The dog beside her raised its head and growled softly, as if already used to protecting the only person who paid attention to it. Donald then crouched down to her level. "I am the grandfather of the boy you saved." Helen didn't know if it was his tone of voice or his gaze that made her feel this conversation was different. "I just did what anyone would do," she murmured. Donald let out a low laugh, but there was no humor in it. "No," he said. "You didn't. If anyone did what you did, my grandson wouldn't have been left to die." Helen averted her gaze, as if she didn't know how to deal with this. Donald took a deep breath and got straight to the point. "I want you to take care of him." She widened her eyes in surprise. What? "I want you to take care of my grandson," he repeated. "I don't want a nanny. I want someone who will look out for him the way you looked out for him that night." Helen laughed, incredulous. "I'm a beggar," she said, looking at herself. "I don't know anything about taking care of children." Donald remained impassive. "You know more than my own son ever knew," he stated. Helen felt a tightness in her chest. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, suspicious. Donald looked her in the eyes. "Because I want him to grow up close to someone who has a heart." The silence between them lasted a few seconds. Helen lowered her head, feeling the weight of the moment. She had spent so many years forgotten by the world, rejected, ignored, that she didn't know how to react to an offer like that. But something inside her told her she couldn't refuse. She nodded slowly. "I accept." Helen felt a chill in her stomach as she said those words. For years, she had been used to expecting nothing from life, to accepting the little she had left without question. But now, by accepting that offer, by allowing herself to belong to something again, she felt she was taking a step toward an unknown path. She looked at Donald, trying to find any hesitation in his gaze, but he simply nodded, as if he knew she wouldn't turn back. She took a deep breath. This was a new beginning, not just for her, but for everyone affected by this story. While a new life was unfolding for her, other destinies were adjusting to the consequences of their own actions. Jacob, who once led a life of privileges, was convicted for negligence and failure to provide assistance. Without money, without influence, and without his father's name to protect him, he had to face the real world alone. For the first time, he would experience the weight of responsibility he had always avoided. His pride crumbled when he realized that no one cared about his former status. Now, he was just another person who needed to fight to survive. Sophia, despite the crime she committed, was given a second chance. Condemned to do community service and required to attend support programs, she knew that she could never erase what she had done, but she was willing to redeem herself. With the support that Donald ensured for her, she had no excuses left for failure. She would raise her son with the dignity she had once feared she would never have. Donald, who had lost a son to cowardice, gained a grandson to love. He took on the commitment to ensure that this child would never again be treated as an unwanted burden. For him, it wasn't about correcting the mistakes of the past, but preventing them from repeating in the future. And Helen, who had wandered invisibly through the world for years, finally found a home. With the responsibility of caring for the child she saved, she rediscovered a purpose within herself that she had thought was lost. She no longer had to fight only to survive. Now she had a reason to continue. Life, with its relentless justice, placed each person in the place they deserved. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.